Welcome to Colonial Outcast. This is a ceasefire-related episode. It is currently Sunday, June 2nd. Things are going to move fast, but we're just going to keep it short-ish and jump right in. Elina Xenophontos, a regular political analyst, calling in from Cyprus, is here today. Hey, thanks for throwing this together real quick. So we're going to talk about the Biden ceasefire proposal, Obama's passive voiced endorsement of said proposal. They always bring him in when they want to clinch something diplomatically for the liberals. Netanyahu's seeming rejection of said proposal, and now a soft-floated water cooler talk that the Israeli government might actually accept it. At 6:30 a.m. Central Daylight Time, NBC published this morning, and quote, an aide to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel had agreed to the framework for the President Joe Biden's plan to bring an end to the war in Gaza, though he said it was, quote, not a good deal. Biden announced Friday, in case you aren't tracking, that Israel had proposed a three-part plan that would ultimately lead to a complete ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, as well as a release of all the hostages who have been held there for the last 8 months. It's, quote, time for the war to end, Biden said. It wasn't a plan that Israel actually proposed, but we'll get into that. A deal is yet to be finalized, and while Biden initially called it an Israeli proposal, Israel's official position remains unclear. NBC News has reached out to the Israeli Prime Minister's office for clarification, they said, but of course they're not going to get any answer from them. So on Saturday, yesterday, during the time of this, with regards to the time of this recording, Netanyahu appeared to undermine the plan, releasing a statement that called a permanent ceasefire in Gaza a non-starter, that Israel's conditions for ending the war have not changed, the destruction of Hamas's military and governing capabilities, the freeing of all hostages, and ensuring that Gaza no longer poses a threat to Israel. In an interview, in Britain's Sunday Times, Ophir Falk, chief foreign policy advisor to Netanyahu, emphasized that Israel was not actually rejecting the deal, saying it was a deal we agreed to. It's not a good deal, but we dearly want the hostages released, all of them. And he also added that Israel's conditions have also not changed, the release of the hostages and the destruction of Hamas. So there's some dissonance going on right now, but within the administration and the Knesset and Netanyahu's government, Hamas, Biden's plan to recast the end to the war, not with the destruction of Hamas as Israel seeks, but with a degraded Hamas no longer capable of carrying out a large-scale attack on Israel like the one by the militant group on October 7th. This is how NBC is writing it. An indefinite war in pursuit of an unidentified notion of total victory will only bog Israel down in Gaza, Biden said. Far-right factions within Netanyahu's cabinet reacted strongly to the proposal laid out by Biden, exposing the competing domestic pressures Netanyahu faces. For instance, Smotrich, the finance minister and chairman of the far-right religious Zionist party, said on X, he would, quote, not be a part of the government that agrees to the proposed outline and ends the war without destroying Hamas, unquote. Okay, well, we've got a lot going on here. Biden made a speech this past Friday, openly threatening, in terms of diplomatic language, Israel to step back and accept a ceasefire deal. He said publicly that the deal was supposedly drafted and put forth by Israel while warning Israel to accept its own deal. So, which means it's total BS. You know, why would Israel need to be coerced into accepting their own deal? Why isn't Hamas the one challenged into accepting it? The Biden administration is therefore, I would say, obliquely asserting that Israel is the main obstacle to a ceasefire that would end the war, which has become an unmitigated political disaster for the Biden administration. This is a significant shift, at least narratively, one that underpins the tensions between Israel and the United States. So, I mean, Elina, you and I have argued consistently that the ICC warrants, the ICJ ruling, and now, as you pointed out over the past couple of days, potentially the fact that Qatar is buying a port in Cyprus, point to the containment of Israel in order to pressure it into accepting the demands of the U.S. So let's look at the most salient section of Biden's speech from Friday. This, I think you clipped this earlier and posted it to your account. Here we go.
There are those in Israel who will not agree with this plan and will call for the war to continue indefinitely. Some are even in the government coalition. And they've made it clear. They want to occupy Gaza. They want to keep fighting for years. And the hostages are not a priority to them. Well, I've urged the leadership in Israel to stand behind this deal, despite whatever pressure comes. And to the people of Israel, let me say this. As someone who's had a lifelong commitment to Israel, as the only American president who's ever gone to Israel in a time of war, as someone who just sent the U.S. forces to directly defend Israel when it was attacked by Iran, I ask you to take a step back and think what will happen if this moment is lost. We can't lose this moment. Indefinite war in pursuit of an unidentified notion of total victory will not bring Israel, will only bog down Israel and Gaza, draining the economic, military, and human resources, and furthering Israel's isolation in the world. That will not bring
hostages home. Now, before we get into it, I just have to ask you a question. When you posted it, did you speed up the audio? Because I was like, Biden's talking real fast right now. He seems more coherent than he usually is.
Yeah, because initially when I posted it, it was meant to, I was trying to fit it within an Instagram story. You obviously have like a minute. So I was like, okay, I need to try and fasten this up and get like the most important aspect. But then people started saying, hey, actually, could you put it so we can repost it? And that's why it sounds faster than normal. That is why he actually sounds like a normal, coherent individual. Yes, okay. I fastened it up. That is why.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that because I was like, wow, Biden's really on point today. So I guess to contextualize everything, just to begin with the basics, like what is this vaunted ceasefire deal? You know, and the question is, Biden really wants this. He wants it so badly that I'm actually going to pull up his X account real quick. Let me share screen. So if you're just listening, I'm pulling up Biden's Twitter. Obviously, he doesn't do it, but he has someone managing his accounts. But yep, we look pinned to his profile. President Biden says Israel has now offered a roadmap to an enduring ceasefire and the release of all hostages. Yesterday, this proposal was transmitted by Qatar to Hamas. Today, I want to lay out its terms for the world. And he posts the 3-phase proposal for a durable peace in the Middle East. And, we did an episode on this last month about right before the Rafah invasion about how Hamas accepted a ceasefire. And it's literally materially exactly the same. It's a 3-phase, potentially 42-day ceasefire that will, hopefully transfer to a permanent ceasefire, lead to the exchange of all hostages, and in a reconstruction plan for Gaza. It's literally what Hamas accepted, Israel refused, and now they're framing it as, this is Israel put it forth. So just in very basic terms, like, what do you think the Biden administration is trying to do? Do political cover for Israel, to make this less embarrassing for them?
Well, this is the thing. So, how we obviously you just said rightfully so, that this is exactly the deal that Hamas had agreed to. Not even a month, it was like 2 to 3 weeks ago. And if you remember, it was literally 2 to 3 weeks ago because they offered it end of April. And then I think by the 5th of May, they had accepted it. May is we've just entered June. So it's like less than even a month ago. And the fact of the matter was, and if you remember, we had actually discussed in a former podcast that this was a CIA broker deal because you had William Burns, which is CIA director and CIA chief. He was in Qatar. He was in Egypt right before the deal was going to be offered to Hamas. He actually got to Egypt before Hamas was to arrive in order to make sure that deal was going to go through. And then there was a whole bunch of internalized tensions behind the scenes, but also openly with the Israeli administration basically coming out and saying that they felt betrayed. This was in the Haaretz. It was also in Axios that they felt betrayed, that the deal that was offered to Hamas and the deal that was accepted by Hamas was not the one that they had initially offered, and that there were alterations, and that the alterations were not made known to them by the US, and they felt betrayed. But then in that same report, the US officials behind the scenes had essentially said, nope, there were no surprises. This was exactly essentially the deal that went through. And at the time, we had actually speculated that this was indicative of the internalized tensions, the intentions between the US and Israel, and also the conflict between the two as to how to approach the situation in Gaza, proving essentially that the U.S. wants to end this war, right? They want this to finish effective immediately, and they're doing so while simultaneously trying to offer, and we've said this before, Israel an aesthetic victory by claiming, which as we saw in the Biden speech, by stating, well, listen, one of the objectives was to prevent an October 7th from happening again. And as you also stated in the intro, Biden basically argues, well, given the fact that Hamas has been significantly hit, although, yes, they still exist, they don't have the power to ever execute on October 7th again. So therefore, the objective in that context has been achieved, therefore giving Israel the aesthetic victory, because we all know, and I think the reports that came out of Haaretz, including former Israeli intelligence veterans, that have said essentially just again within this month that we need at least a minimum of another 2 to 3 years to defeat Hamas, and that was a minimum, stating that I think Hamas had military capabilities, including tunnels and personnel, at around 65%. So we know that Hamas hasn't been depleted. We know that Hamas still has an ability to resist, but this is the United States trying to get Israel to end this conflict, which, as we've also said, reiterated multiple times, is politically destroying them. It's isolating them from the world, as Biden openly stated, depleting them economically, and essentially not achieving anything beyond self-destruction. So the United States is trying to prevent Israel from destroying itself even further, but also to maintain its own agenda in the region, which right now, which we can get into, is feigning. And so that's kind of a synthesized version of what Biden was trying to accomplish with this deal.
Right. And, we can send them all the money and all the weapons that we want. Like, that alone is not what achieves military victory. I mean, we're seeing that in Ukraine, right? We just keep sending them money, keep sending them bombs, but, we're losing ground, losing momentum. And just for the audience's sake, when you bring up intelligence veterans from Israel saying that they've lost or that they cannot defeat Hamas, I'm just going to give a quote from May 18th. Former deputy director of the Mossad, Ram Ben Barak, who's now MP in the Knesset, said on May 18th, and I quote, "The war in Gaza is aimless and we are clearly losing it. We are forced to return to fighting in the same areas, losing more soldiers, losing on the international stage, damaging relations with the United States, and causing the economy to collapse. Show me one thing we have succeeded in." Yeah, there is no day after plan. There is no off ramp. There is no exit strategy. So, the Biden administration is trying to give them an off ramp, save face. I mean, everybody who's knows how the game works sees it exactly for what it is. But this is a lot about courting public opinion, appeasing the pro-Israel supporters in the United States and in the West, giving them something that they can accept while still trying to preserve America's position in the region. And, Hamas isn't defeated. October 7th could happen again. Right now, we're seeing unprecedented casualty rates among IDF soldiers, not just in Rafah, but in the north and middle Gaza, where they're supposed to have been cleared and no longer exist. So, yes, it is aimless. It's pointless. There is no offer. There is no exit strategy. The only way they can defeat Hamas is literally by killing everybody in Gaza, which is not feasible. So, that's not going to end. And so they need an off ramp, and to really solidify, Biden's position, they tap, as usual, Barack Obama. So they brought Obama in for this one, and let's look at his kind of speech, because it actually kind of hurt me a little bit. And it just goes to show you that Obama, despite winning the Nobel Peace Prize, isn't really on the level.
No.
So, Obama, in order to lock in liberal acceptance of, Biden's proposal, there's a lot of liberal Zionists living in New York and on the East and West Coast, that this will help to, get them on board. He says a ceasefire alone won't ease the terrible pain of Israelis whose loved ones were butchered or abducted by Hamas, or the Palestinians whose families have been shattered by the subsequent war. It won't resolve the longstanding conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, or answer the contentious issues surrounding a two-state solution or continuing settler activity in West Bank. But what it can't do now is put a stop to the ongoing bloodshed, help families reunite, and allow a surge of humanitarian aid to help desperate, hungry people. It can save lives here and now, and it can lay the foundation for what will be a long and difficult road to a future, as the U.S. tries to string out a two-state solution as long as possible. Difficult road to a future which Israel is secure and at peace with its neighbors, and Palestinians finally have the security, freedom, and self-determination that they have sought for so long. Now, I don't really want to get into the semantics of this, but I just had to bring it. The wording was bullshit. First of all, it's all passive voice. So, like, when Obama says a ceasefire alone won't ease the terrible pain of Israelis whose loved ones were butchered or abducted by Hamas. Look at how ownership and action is applied and not applied here in this statement. It's intentional. Hamas butchered and abducted. Ownership and action are directly applied to Hamas, but all the state of Israel's actions aren't mentioned at all. Palestinian families were like shattered by whom? Who shattered them? The war, this nebulous concept, like this allegory for like human strife. The verb is strategically placed here to avoid establishing ownership. While Hamas butchered it, Israel did not, even though the death toll from Israelis' actions dwarfs October 7, 10x. At least, according to the statement, they did not even kill. The war did.
It just happened.
Yeah, the contrast in language is deliberate, and obviously, it's meant to reinforce the time-tested narrative of Israel good, Palestine bad. But at least, so that's how it's being framed. But at least they're pushing for a ceasefire. So Obama, again, they bring him in. Yeah, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say about what happens whenever they bring Obama in. So he's sort of the tool that the Democrats use because of his popularity, because of the image he has more so than the actual realistic element of his policies that he executed. Even when Biden was running for presidency the first time around, whoever they always bring Obama in to sort of validate and influence the public, but also to solidify the Democratic position. So the fact that they brought Obama in at this particular point, he was instructed to make a sort of speech this sort of statement essentially to promote the deal goes to show how vehemently the Biden administration needs this to go through. And I also want to say the fact that Biden in his speech, if you noticed, okay, I sped up the speech, but if you go back and watch the speech, he actually did really emphasize, and he almost spoke in a very threatening language. I call to the fractions within the Israeli government who are calling for for unidentifiable goals within Gaza, to are attempting to reoccupy. They are occupying Gaza anyway, but to control Gaza again. And those that, who are basically an obstacle to these to stand back. And he also spoke to the population of Israel. I call to the Israeli people to take a step back because this is monumental. And the way I see it now, Biden is doing what I guess he should have done 3 weeks ago with the former deal that was brokered by the CIA. He's now putting it on record that we support this, whereas before it was done behind the scenes, and they were hoping Israel would agree to the terms and conditions, and they didn't. But now they've put Netanyahu in a very difficult position because now it's become officialized. This is where we stand as the U.S. We support this. We back this. They've brought in Obama into this. And it's also very interesting to me to see how the way in which Biden sort of uses that threatening language, like this is monumental. And basically, he's sort of alluding to the fact that if you do not accept this now, well, what's to happen from here on? It's sort of going to be on you. It sounded almost as though there might be a change in the way the U.S. is going to be dealing with it. And I think that's going to tie in with the ICJ ruling, but we can get into that a bit later on. So I think it really solidifies the U.S.'s position.
Yeah, and also it's interesting because it's an acknowledgement of not just the external pressures on Israel, where he talks about Israel becoming more and more isolated. By speaking directly to the people, he's recognizing the amount of civil strife going on in Israel right now. And I'm going to pull up a clip from that Al Jazeera posted this morning that summarizes the situation and the feelings of a lot of people within Israel. And while I do that, I just want to bring up one point that Obama, again, he's the only Nobel Prize winner that's all actively bombed another Nobel Peace Prize winner, because he authorized that hospital bombing in Kunduz against Doctors Without Border in 2015 in Afghanistan. So just another fun fact about how like good of a dude he is. All right. Anyways, internal pressure. This is Al Jazeera reporting from a couple hours ago, Sunday.
These have been demanding that their government do something to bring those held captive in Gaza home. And yet again, a heavy police presence.
Massive protests right now in Tel Aviv. We're seeing footage of that right now.
But this time there was a glimmer of hope for some. Just 24 hours earlier, they listened to US President Joe Biden call for an end to the war, reassuring them Hamas's capabilities have been greatly reduced and can no longer attack Israel. He urged both sides to take the three-phase deal.
Our partner is Biden and not the government of Israel, to our sorrow. So we have to come here, and I come here every week to save the hostages, to finalize the war, to bring them home, and to get a new elections, because we have to save Israel also, not only the hostages. And this government will take us to hell.
While the US presented it as an Israeli proposal, many say their government is incapable, accusing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of sabotaging deals for his own political survival, and far-right ministers advocating the resettling of Gaza.
The extremists in the Netanyahu government are opposing this deal. They have allowed the minority extremists to attack President Biden. They want the war to go on for an indefinite period of time. These people would sacrifice even the captives. Gantz, Eisencourt, Gallant, this is your last chance to make sure that Netanyahu doesn't destroy this deal. I hear your voices. Tell the citizens that you support this deal, and that includes putting an end to this war.
The ultra-nationalist ministers Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich have reacted angrily by threatening to quit if Benjamin Netanyahu goes ahead with this latest ceasefire proposal. A move that could lead to the dissolving of the coalition government as the Prime Minister tries hard to cling onto power. While thousands of protesters gathered in Tel Aviv and other cities, opposition leader Yair Lapid slammed the government, calling it the worst and most wanted in Israel's history, promising to back Netanyahu, though, if he accepts the deal. But Netanyahu is still insisting on getting rid of Hamas before he signs a full ceasefire agreement. Depending on who you speak to, some will blame Israel for not securing a ceasefire deal since November. Others will blame Hamas for changing terms and conditions. And international pressure doesn't guarantee that a deal will even go through. But for now, though, the protesters and families of those held captive have this message.
And at the end, we have this massive canvas tarp or sign held by dozens and dozens of people that says at the Tel Aviv protest, that says literally, Biden save them now. Or Biden save them from, wait, what does it say? Yeah, Biden save them from Netanyahu. Yeah.
This is the thing. So at one point, the Al Jazeera reporter said, that she even implied that although Biden had said that this is an Israeli deal, beyond the threatening language used, I find it very interesting that, in a way, Biden also kind of threw Netanyahu under the bus, because he was very nuanced about it. He made it also very lucid that it is, if there is an obstacle right now to this deal, it would be because of Netanyahu and it would be because of Israel. And this is also very, very pivotal point, because up until this point, you see the United States was always trying to pin this on Hamas, on the Palestinian resistance. But now we're seeing seeing that the Biden administration is essentially put a deal forward, and it's directed itself towards warning Israel. And it's sort of alluded to the fact that if it doesn't go through, this is on Israel. Now, with regards to what's happening, the internalized strife, this is a very interesting thing. And this is what I meant earlier when I said that the Biden administration and the U.S. has essentially cornered Israel, and particularly Netanyahu. Because if Netanyahu, let's just say for a second, if he does accept this deal, if it goes through, right, and Hamas accept the deal, which by all rational, factors, I believe that Hamas will, because it's very closely aligned. The proposal is very closely aligned to the proposal that they had made in February, and also the one in May that they had accepted. So if Netanyahu accepts this, what does it mean? So first of all, you're going to have the UN institutions are going to be able to re-enter Gaza. It means that there are going to be investigations that are going to begin to take place within Gaza. That's going to reveal huge levels of war crimes that obviously Israel up until this point has tried to camouflage. This is obviously going to be detrimental to Israel, and particularly to Netanyahu and his government. It also means that once this is over, there's going to be the investigation into October 7th by Israel itself to see as to the failures of the Israeli establishment and their failures to prevent October 7th, but also to what extent the IDF may have killed its own civilians, and by how much, or how much the damage was by the IDF. Then Netanyahu obviously has his corruption trials, but I think what's also most significant, and what we're seeing through these images, is the tarnished and very divided population of Israel, because there are those that are calling for elections and to throw out this government, but there is also a huge far right sector that does support Ben Gvir, that does support resettlement of Gaza. We've seen these extremists, and we all remember that Ben Gvir has armed over, I think, something like 200,000 Israeli settlers and extremists. And if Netanyahu was to accept this, this means that their agenda and their objectives will not be met the way that they want them to be met. And this could truthfully turn into a hot civil war, where we could actually be seeing internalized strife turn very violent between these different factions in Israeli society, from the so-called more right moderate and the more extreme right-wing Israelis that really do want to resettle Gaza. So it's very significant what's happening now.
Yeah, and if you guys want to hear more about the potential internecine warfare that could result from what comes from a ceasefire, what comes from a potential two-state solution where settlers would have to move out of illegal settlements back to Israel proper, we did a two-part series called The New Israeli Civil War a couple weeks ago, so you can check that out. Yeah, but this difference between the far right extremists, which we call like Israeli Judeans, and then the liberal Zionists and the Tel Avivians, who aren't really liberal. They're just far right. But there is this massive divide because when you see these protests in Tel Aviv and other metropolitan centers within Israel, they're not really they're not calling for a two-state solution. They're not mentioning the Palestinians at all. It's just Netanyahu's government, and they're sick of this. And the hostage thing is central to their political grievances. Yes, of course, the corruption, the lack of elections. They're concerned about their own veneer of democracy. And there's within the past few days, a lot of damning stuff has come out, and like especially at NBC.
It has to do with self-preservation.
Yeah. So first of all, some stories broke. Netanyahu won't, in NBC 2 days ago, Netanyahu won't agree to hostage release deal unless it polls well for him. Israeli families say they were told. The Israeli government made a conscious and deliberate decision to sacrifice the hostages, the Hostage Family Forum said. So these hostage families are becoming a rallying cry. And of course, they're at odds with, the more far right settlers who don't give a damn about the hostages. But what we're seeing is a complete isolation of Netanyahu. First of all, the opposition leader, Yair Lapid, and, some of his other political opponents within the Knesset, who aren't like progressive or left wing at all. They just oppose Netanyahu, are putting him in a difficult position. It was like, yeah, we want the government gone. We want elections to be held. But also, if Netanyahu accepts a ceasefire, will back him. So Netanyahu will look like completely unreasonable, and if he doesn't, but if he accepts it, he's screwed. So like he's kind of in an impossible position as well. He's completely isolated, which is what the Biden administration wants. They've been setting this up for months now.
Yeah, that's why Biden, as I said, he went on record saying making these comments, and that's why he's warning them. Because what happens if they don't? What happens if Netanyahu really says, no, I do not accept this deal, and he goes on with his usual rhetoric? What's going to happen is that I believe the United States is going to use the ICJ ruling, because at one point someone's going to put, like when the next United Nations Security Council meeting is going to go through, the ICJ ruling will probably be referred in the United Nations Security Council, which is going to require a vote. And I think when that happens, this time the United States is obviously not going to veto any decision to basically halt a Rafah operation, which is essentially what the ICJ requests, and to bring in obviously humanitarian aid in the United Nations. So I believe that they're going to use that as leverage. I think the United States, that's sort of like the plan B if they do not accept this. And that's why the language that Biden was using, and if Obama to back it, it's threatening language, because he says this is a moment you do not want to lose. Think about it, because this is monumental. If you don't, and they're basically stating you don't have the economic ability nor the military ability, and we all know that their economy has actually retracted by 20%. It's going to continue to retract at this particular rate, and we all know that the only reason they're able to sustain the wars for as long as they have, or the genocide, is because of the United States. So this is sort of the United States turning around saying, okay, you can't economically fund it, you can't militarily fund it. Take what we're giving you right now, because the U.S. could easily say, right, we're not going to continue funding this anymore. Yeah. And although they're aesthetically showing support for Israel, it doesn't serve the United States at all to have this going. So Netanyahu, he's really in a really difficult situation now. If he doesn't accept, then the United States would probably use its power in the United Nations Security Council to make him accept. Or if he does accept, his government back home will probably collapse. But even if the opposition does have his back, which they will, because I can't pronounce that. I said
Lapid, or I just say Lapid, or whatever.
That's it. Lapid. Yeah, Lapid said obviously he will back him, because Lapid really wants this deal to go through, because he understands the very existence of Israel depends on trying to resolve the crisis that Israel is in right now. However, Netanyahu is screwed anyway, because of everything that I'd aforementioned. The investigations into everything went from the United Nations, the Israeli investigations into October 7th, the trial, and the internal strife that's going to occur in Israel. So yeah, it's really a tough situation now.
Yeah, and I just wanted to harken back to that Al Jazeera video. There was this moment where this activist was speaking to a crowd, and she was literally calling on Yair Lapid, a guy who said, if the media is unbiased, it serves Hamas. And Yoav Gallant, she was also calling on Yoav Gallant, defense minister, who described Palestinians as human animals, to come to the rescue of the government. So yeah, none of this has to do with the Palestinians, but the administration is trying to give cover for Israel's complete failure. The administration wants the war to finish in order to reestablish the status quo in the region, which we're going to get into in a second. But I do agree with the ICJ being used as a lever, because the United States would actually come on top. If they end up supporting and backing the ICC investigation or the ICC ruling, they will have the pretense of upholding a rules-based order, which serves the ICJ as a liberal Western institution. And yeah, they can just go back to the status quo, hopefully try and push through Saudi normalization, revive a performative Oslo Accords-esque narrative about a vague two-state solution in the future. But yeah, the reestablishment of the status quo is what Yair Lapid, as the opposition leader, represents, an Israel that will listen to the desires of the United States administration, while still being far right AF, So
I completely agree with you. Yeah, that's exactly what they're trying to do.
And so the status quo in the region, you wrote when we were coming up with notes for this, that a part of that is to push through the Saudi normalization deal, which we've been talking about for months now, of the normalization between of relations and a security agreement and a trade agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which is difficult politically for Saudi Arabia to accomplish now in square with its own population when Israel's committing a genocide against other Arabs. But it's a massive priority for the United States. We've talked about the new Silk Road, the Mumbai to Europe pipeline, which normalization between Saudi and Israel is monumentally important for. But you were saying, and I kind of agree with this, that Saudi normalization is no longer necessarily feasible in the way it was before October 7th.
No. So this is the thing. So whilst all this has been going on, something that people haven't been paying as much attention to is the fact that behind the scenes, the United States has been speaking with Saudi Arabia now to normalize and reach agreements which are bilateral, which will no longer include Israel. And when Antony Blinken was pressed on this matter, and I think it was reported by the Washington Post, they asked him, why is he pressing so much for a Saudi deal? And now bear in mind, the Saudi deal is, it requires two things. So it's sort of like a defense pact, nuclear capabilities, and obviously pathway to Palestinian statehood, right? And he was asked why he's pushing so hard for this deal between Saudi Arabia and the United States. And Blinken, one of the things that he had actually said was that he also wanted to use this momentum, or rather this deal, to impose on Israel and all future Israeli governments the idea of Palestinian statehood, because it would still at some point include Israel. So his idea is to try to secure Saudi Arabia right now, and then bring Israel in the long run once things calm down, right? And then use the so-called deal to impose the idea of a statehood for Palestinians. Now, if we go back to the Oslo Accords, I just want to say something about this very quickly. That's sort of what the Oslo Accords was. Like, they forced the Palestinians, when Yasser Arafat was in a particularly difficult situation following the Gulf War, to accept these agreements that there was going to be a Palestinian, we're going to work towards a Palestinian state within the next 5 years. And then it was very ambiguous language, but by giving the illusion that the Palestinians will have a state, it sort of subdued the Arab world, tried to delude the Palestinian people, tried to delude the Arab population into thinking that there was progress being made, whilst at the same time, they were proceeding to normalization and trying to harmonize Israel within the greater region over the years without actually ever having to create a Palestinian state. And that's exactly where the United States wants to be. And it's important for the United States to have Saudi Arabia because of obviously everything that we've spoken about, but it's not going to happen. Even if the deals were to go through, even if Saudi Arabia was to start to consider the United States, one of the main reasons the United States wants Saudi Arabia so much is to re-secure Saudi Arabia as a base for the U.S. Yeah, and for Iran, intelligence gathering, also to sort of pull Saudi Arabia out of the sphere of influence of China, of Russia, because now obviously Saudi Arabia is a new inducted country into BRICS, and are now talking about the BRI and becoming sort of like high-tech producing state. And it doesn't even make any sense from the United States perspective at this point. It's a lost battle because Saudi Arabia's greatest trading partner by threefold is China. China is also the world's leader right now in electronic car production, which is something that Saudi Arabia is interested in entering in order to diversify its economy. Also, the idea of securing Saudi Arabia against Iran doesn't even make sense anymore when you've got the Prince of Saudi Arabia. He was in Iran just last week, and every other month or so, you see Iranian officials in Saudi Arabia or Saudi Arabian officials in Iran. So Iran isn't a threat anymore, following the sort of peace agreements that were established in March of 2023 last year, thanks to obviously China sort of brokering that particular deal between the two. So we're seeing a complete revamp of the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So what is the U.S. offering here? A protection against Iran, but the relationship with Iran has significantly changed. And then the idea that they're going to somehow offer Saudi Arabia something to sway them away from China, when China is a huge economic partner for Saudi Arabia and will dramatically change its economic status quo, is ridiculous, because they don't really have something to outmatch the offer that China right now has on the table. And then the one last thing that we have to discuss here is that the idea of allowing Saudi Arabia to have nuclear capabilities, that's something that isn't going to sit too well with Israel anyway. So again, I don't see how. This is what the U.S. plans, right? This is their objective: calm the situation down, reassert an Oslo Accords scenario, which is again very 90s mentality. This is not the 90s anymore, and then sort of normalize or make these agreements with Saudi Arabia as if Saudi Arabia no longer has different options. The dynamic has changed, and that moment has been lost a long time ago. So, but this is what another reason why the U.S. really, really wants this situation to stop, because they want to go back to the way things were. But the problem is they will not go back to the way things were.
Yeah, I mean, the administration is trying to give cover. They're trying to say, like, we will no longer risk our own geopolitical future in order to appease the Israeli regime, but the window's passed. The irreparable damage is done. And I do think it's a really interesting point that you brought up about the nuclearization of Saudi Arabia and how it won't sit well with Israel having an Arab country that's also a nuclear power. Israel, it's an open secret, has nukes, and it allows them to act with impunity in the region. And they like acting with impunity. They like to have the biggest stick in town. And that's one of the reasons why Iran becoming a nuclear power and being able to resist Israel in a different way terrifies them. So they won't be pumped about Saudi Arabia having it either. So especially if Saudi Arabia and Iran are going to repair relations, which is already happening, and one's a nuclear power and one could quickly become another nuclear power, they'd be terrified. So but then again, United States geopolitical interests are already compromised in the region. So it's just like straight up damage control right now.
It's damage control. They're trying to save what they can. It's sort of like you're drowning, but you're trying to grab onto what you can, but it's just too far gone at this point. This should have ended a long time ago. But like we've said before, I don't think they expected Israel to fail to this degree. I don't think they expected the operation aka genocide in Gaza to go the way it has. And the PR campaign behind all this was so tragic. So I think now the US is really desperate. And I do also think that because everything has accumulated to such a disastrous point in the Middle East, they also want this to end so that they can refocus on Ukraine. Because Ukraine is a project they're not letting go, even though that's a failing project, and it's just escalating in Ukraine now. So that's another thing that's going on.
Yeah, and I do think we did an episode last week called Gaza 2035, Ukraine and Taiwan that I invite you guys to check out because it's kind of beyond the scope of this conversation. But it's not just Ukraine; it's also they're looking for a flashpoint in Taiwan as well. So like the entire military command echelon just does not want to go back to, the sandbox. They don't want to go back to the Middle East. That's what they call it, and they don't want to go back there. It's last decade's war. They're looking for new ones, new exciting ones. So they don't want to get back into it. Now, I wanted to circle back to the Hamas accepting the ceasefire. We were talking about it before we started filming about how Hamas probably won't accept the proposal quickly. Like I think last time they sat on a week because how it was framed by Biden. Like if they just accepted the proposal quickly after he said it was Israel's proposal, that's not the optics they want going forward. That doesn't further their own PR objectives and information operation objectives. So that's why they'll probably just sit on it, at least for a symbolic time. And then to go through, as you brought up, legal documents to make sure they don't miss any loopholes in the ceasefire language that Israel can exploit because, they love their loopholes and they do want to keep this going. So they'll look for any pretext to be able to settle or, basically have a bad faith ceasefire. So I was hoping you could touch on that, the legal aspect, since you're the legal person around here.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, last time as well, when the offer came, I think the offer that they made in April was around the 29th. And then it took them about a week again to basically respond. So Hamas taking several days up to a week to respond to a ceasefire deal. It's very normal. And again, this is the thing. So we have just a basic outline, right? We got 1, 2, 3, 4 points. But when you're looking at these agreements, they can play on the semantics very easily because we don't have access to the entire documents. The deal itself could be broken down into, oh, if this happens, then we have a right to re-enter Gaza, for example. Or if there's all these little nuances that the United States could have placed in said deal to basically, like you said, create a bad faith sort of deal that would allow Israel to sort of reignite its operations in Gaza. So they need to be very, very careful. So although aesthetically what we're looking at right now, which is sort of like a very brief overview, the synopsized version of the deal does match and align with everything else we've seen up until in the last couple of months, particularly the last one, albeit having said that, even that was obviously the synopsized version. Hamas has to make sure, and it does take a long time to go through all of this, go through all the language, and break it down to make sure, like, okay, this is complete. Because they might also say we accept it, but if they find something that they maybe find a bit problematic, they might need to clarify the terms. They might need to clarify what this means and what that means. I mean, that's how it sort of works before they say the A-OK. I mean, that's how any sort of smart legal person, and I'm sure they have their legal team that is looking into. And also, by the way, it's not even just Hamas, because it has to be Hamas has made a statement in the past to say that when a ceasefire deal is accepted, it will be a unanimous acceptance, because it has to go through all the Palestinian resistance factions. So that includes PIJ and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs, etc. They want it to be something that is unanimously accepted. That's something that Hamas has pointed out copious times now. So it will take, I think we'll probably be looking at a few days again to maybe a week, and they will probably respond. And I think it will be positive.
Yeah, I do think so. However, we're not dealing with a rational actor here within Israel. So who knows what Netanyahu is going to do? He might try a desperate Hail Mary. Okay, sorry to use American football references. He might try some desperate career-saving move that nobody expects either, because he is a political animal. He's a survivalist, and now he's cornered. So I expect him to conduct himself as animalistically when he's caught. So yeah, who knows?
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I think June's going to be a really interesting month, because a ceasefire deal probably will be signed, and then we have no idea what Smotrich and Ben Gvir and their cohort of lunatics are going to do. So that's one other thing. So,
oh yes, but it's what we said before. I don't know what's going to happen in Israel. I really think it's not going to be in it. I think in Gaza things will calm down slowly, but I think in Israel it's going to escalate socially as well. I think it's going to escalate dramatically.
No, I think once a ceasefire is called and the conversation of a two-state solution, even if it's vague, even though the Biden administration and Western leaders don't actually really think it's going to happen, they have no intention of implementing it. The fact that the conversation is going to happen and that people are going to demand details on what that looks like is going to just per force cause those social tensions within Israel, because that's going to be like the main thing people are talking about, and it's a really contentious issue. Now, since we're I just want to spend the last segment talking about what you brought up. You noticed that Qatar is buying a port in Cyprus. You're in Cyprus right now. I think the port's Larnaca, right? So let me pull up this article. Port, yeah. So, ABC News, Qatar's ruler looking to invest in energy, ports, and high tech in Cyprus. Official says the Emir of Qatar is looking to, buy the port. And this is significant, because we were talking about Israel originally buying the port and had to deal with the exploitation of the gas reserves in the Gaza Marine Basin, and everybody expected Israel to buy the port, but now Qatar is swooping in, and this is going to involve like Russia and China potentially. So I'm going to act as an interlocutor and just ask you the most basic questions, because I don't think a lot of people are talking to about this. So Qatar, a strategic ally of the United States in the region, they've been the intermediary government that's always worked with hostile actors. So like they worked with the Taliban, they housed the Taliban so we could have diplomatic relationships with the Taliban during the Afghan war. They have Hamas, Hezbollah officials there that, the CIA will go over to Qatar and work with them. So an ally in the region, they help us with, you could just say like intel stuff for the layman. what's the significance of them coming in and buying this port that's going to be vital for the potential like East Med pipeline and the Gaza Marine base and stuff? And Israel was expected to buy it. So what are we looking at essentially?
Okay, so that's the interesting thing. So Israel was hell bent on buying it, and at the beginning, the first few months of the Gaza genocide, aka whatever war, Israeli officials were constantly in Cyprus. I mean, the relationship between the establishment here and the establishment in Israel was very, very closely related, especially in the first few months. But that has significantly died down. Now, initially, the port was going to cost somewhere like 150 million or more than that, and it was sort of like a done deal. But then what's happened is that Israel was failing to deliver on its payments systematically. It wasn't paying on time, or it just wasn't paying at all. And eventually they had to bow out. And this also speaks volumes as to the current state of Israel, economically speaking. I mean, the fact that they weren't even able to carry out their own payments. And we have to remember that one of the main reasons that they were going to buy the port was essentially to provide a sort of alternative to the Haifa port, apparently, in case there were going to be any Hezbollah attacks from that port, and therefore to be able to continue its trade routes as normal. But most significantly, the port in Larnaca, if you look at it's like literally 20 minutes from Gaza, the whole purpose of the port was to control the maritime corridor, or the humanitarian corridor that was being built by the US, or the port that was being built by the US in Gaza, and obviously the port in Larnaca. The idea was that they were supposed to be monitoring everything that goes into Gaza from that port. So it was another means by which to sort of assert their colonial control over Gaza by being the ones to monitor what goes in and out again, which is pretty much in alignment to everything that Israel has been doing to Gaza since pretty much 2007, aka the blockade and the siege. So that was the purpose behind it, and by establishing that maritime corridor, they basically control that entire region. And from the U.S.'s standpoint, that isn't also a bad deal, because it allows them to control trade routes, the Suez Canal, and obviously how that plays geopolitically with regards to Iran and China and Russia. So that was the idea. But now Israel has basically bowed out because it can't actually afford it. And Qatar, which is supposed to be sort of an actor that I guess is more in defiance of Israel in certain ways, although they're both allied to the US, their relations are complicated to say the least, has now bought out the port, which means that the humanitarian corridor and the maritime corridor that was supposed to be established between Cyprus and Gaza is now controlled essentially by, if this goes through, right? But I believe it will. You don't have the Emir of Qatar and all his highest ranking officials in Cyprus last week. I feel they're not serious about it. They're now buying the port. They're going to be controlling the corridor. But it's not just that. They're investing in energy here, and they're going to be the ones to start to extract Cypriot gas. And they basically want to establish like a sort of energy hub. And it basically means we're seeing Qatar come in to directly have influence over the East Med pipeline, the trade routes that they want to establish, and sort of bypassing, in a way, Israel at this point. This is what it's looking like. And the US must be, honestly, I think the US probably is in on it. And when you consider the fact that the ICC ruling came through, the ICC arrest warrants were being pursued just last week. The ICJ is now also targeting Israel to stop the war in Rafah. And I think it's all coming together, and it looks like what is happening behind the scenes. And I think the US is very much involved here. And that's why, Biden came out to offer this deal. It's all about containment of Israel, who is an unstable actor, in order to stabilize the region, in order to, if they want to establish like these alternatives to the BRI, they're looking at alternatives means to do so that would not include Israel. And that is very significant as to the future of Israel and how the US views Israel, which up until this point, it was one of the pillars of the US in the Middle East. And now it looks as though they've realized that they can't put all their eggs in one basket with Israel. So we're seeing a drastic change in what's happening in the region.
Yeah, I do think that's significant because, but before this happened, it was all talk about, Israel basically controlling what is essentially that massive trade junction, which is vital for the East Med pipeline, which we've talked about, that's meant to rival the Silk Road project for the Belt and Road Initiative that China and Russia and now Iran are pioneering. So yeah, this is completely reliant on Western the West is completely relying on this. This goes back to the war in Ukraine and the energy shortage in Europe, and it's vitally important. And
even the war in Syria.
Yeah, and I mean, I can't imagine that the United States and Western leaders aren't behind this, because it's so vitally important to the Western interests in the future that why would you put an unstable actor basically in charge of one of the main junction points of that?
I mean, the fact that Israel couldn't afford the damn port, they couldn't even make the
Yeah,
payments.
that's hilarious.
It's ridiculous. I mean, and if the United States really wanted Israel to sort of take control of that port, they would have probably bought the damn port for them, or given them an extra amount of, like, here's aid, buy the damn port. But I think they're abandoning that ship entirely. And I think Qatar coming in now is essentially controlling the idea of the energy reroutes that the US and the West want to establish in this region. Because, like, that's why I brought up Syria as well. One of the reasons Syria has been, war torn since 2012 is, the trade and pipeline routes that were going to be established for there. But because now it's an unstable actor, even though obviously Russia came in and tried to stabilize Syria, but it's prevented Syria from being able to sort of, and obviously now we also have the occupation of the oil fields of Syria. It means that Syria is no longer a contender. That's why, Israel would have been a good and viable option. But now that Israel's not looking like a viable option, the US is now looking at alternatives by which to deal with this situation. So Qatar is coming in and pushing out Israel. And that also puts Netanyahu in a difficult position.
Yeah.
That's also cornering Netanyahu.
I kind of feel like that's the theme of this episode. Isolation, not just Netanyahu, but strategically Israel. Now, I mean, Netanyahu's going to be scapegoated. He's going to be sacrificed on the altar of public outrage. But yeah, Israel is geopolitically isolated, and the United States is, you could argue, contributing to that. Now, there's one last point I wanted to make. It was this idea that I had that you kind of expanded on before we started filming. It's like, I said, I also think Hamas will have to be recognized as a legit governing authority for peace to actually happen, or not. But you qualified that with like a coalition of the resistance movements and stuff. So I was hoping before we end, you could expand on that real quick for like 5 minutes.
Yeah. So in addition to all this, there's been some other interesting things that are playing out. And by the way, I just want to add something very interesting going back to Saudi Arabia. There was also the China Arab Summit just this week, a few days ago. And all the Arab leaders were in China, including Saudi leaders. And Saudi Arabia had actually expressed that they believe China should be on the negotiating table between Israel and Hamas, which again is so telling, because this Saudi Arabia has historically obviously been a US ally, but now they're saying to deal with the Palestinian-Israeli issue, China should be involved. So again, it's also the political influence that the U.S. is losing, as in, because once, ideally, the U.S. would be the one to be the broker between these deals, but now Saudi Arabia and the Arab states want China. So this is very significant. Having said that, so China and Russia behind the scenes. So we saw Hamas. Multiple Hamas leaders had actually visited, I think, Moscow several times since beginning October 7th. Now, the first two times, they never really said why they were there. They said, oh, it was about the hostages. Yeah, sure. Senior Hamas officials are in Moscow to talk about the hostages. Like, this wasn't something that they could have discussed. But the third time, it became very apparent. They actually vocalized that it was the idea of creating a Palestinian governing authority that would unify all the Palestinian factions under a singular Palestinian government. So what that would do is de jure, so it means legally speaking, eradicate Hamas, which means that Hamas would not officially exist, by integrating them into a Palestinian authority in conjunction with other Palestinian leaders as well. Now, this is significant for the Palestinians as well, because this would finally end any sort of internalized fractures within Palestinian society. They're going to have a singular governing force, which I think is very important for them when they're on the negotiating table. And then the second aspect behind this is that it really eliminates it's going to undermine the Palestinian Authority. Bear in mind, a lot of people who worked for the Palestinian Authority had actually completely resigned and no longer want to participate with the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority was established by the United States. So it undermines a creation of the US to try to subjugate the Palestinian people. And it's further going to, it's going to eradicate the idea that a terrorist organization exists, Israel can no longer use, oh, Hamas is a non-rational actor, they're a terrorist entity, because it doesn't technically exist. It's going to be another Palestinian authority entirely. And it's going to take away any excuse given by the US and Israel to no longer to basically not negotiate with what they say is an irrational actor, aka Hamas. And so Russia has been working on this behind the scenes, and I think it was one of the Palestinian members of council, Mustafa Barghouti, who basically said it's the first time in Palestinian history that we're seeing such a real unification, and we're looking at reestablishing a Palestinian government. And China now is also participating in these negotiations between the Palestinian factions. So it's going to be very interesting to see if they succeed in doing this, and Hamas doesn't exist, and then new authorities established. Well, then Israel can no longer use those excuses of, oh, they're a terrorist organization and we can't rationalize with them. And it's really going to bring Palestinian statehood so much more closer to the table, because they're going to be coerced to negotiate with this party. And it also goes to show the importance now that Russia and China are going to be the importance of Russia and China in this entire conflict, let's say, because if they succeed in doing so, then the new Palestinian government, right, this new government that they might establish authority, can say, we will not negotiate with Israel unless China is involved, for example, which Saudi Arabia has also stated. So that means that China could very well take on the reins. And China has made it very clear that they have a much more pro-Palestinian stance than obviously the United States. So it's a very interesting development, and obviously something I think we should all follow.
Yeah. So I mean that would be politically expedient to de jure make sure Hamas no longer exists, but de facto Hamas officials would still be in power making decisions. But you know, in name, they wouldn't. So, I mean, that's something. And from my contacts, when I was speaking through third parties to people in Doha, was that Hamas kind of recognizes that they cannot remain in power. So, I mean, but they could do that. They could do that little sleight of hand, and you know, kind of still be at the decision making.
Yeah, they're going to do a little switcheroo. Yeah, they did a little switcheroo. Yeah, it's a very smart move. And I remember when I was seeing this happen, nobody's talking about it. I was like, is nobody talking about this? Is so important. What Russia's doing right now is actually a big KO. And it was really interesting because when Russia engaged, when Russia actually did that, and that was announced that this is what they're doing in Moscow, that was also when the Israeli United Nations representative, the General Assembly, went on a huge anti-Russia hate speech. I mean, he was just fuming. He was spitting hell out of his mouth. He just was about to, I think they were ready to start, I think they wanted to nuke Russia at that point. Like, they were so outraged because it's actually a very brilliant move from the perspective of the Palestinians. And yeah, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah. So wrapping up, main themes: political isolation for Israel, perhaps civil strife and internecine violence after a ceasefire is called, Benjamin Netanyahu being scapegoated, and just a general loss of geopolitical influence for the United States. They're just trying to save what they can because they should have ended this a long time ago. So, yeah, and then a ceasefire deal, I wouldn't expect any movement on that until probably next weekend. Based off precedents, Hamas probably won't respond during the week. So, hope that was informative for you guys. Thanks so much for listening. We're actually going to be on Patreon later. We're launching that so we can start paying people. And you'll get some unique benefits. More on that later. We have an episode that we're going to be releasing early on Patreon later this evening about the Joint Chiefs in 1947 writing a memo to President Truman saying that Israel would compromise our strategic interests, not just in the region, but throughout the world. And, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That memo from 1947, we get into it. It doesn't exist on digitized form, so you can't access it on the internet. We had to pull it from the National Archives, and that's our special episode. So thanks so much for listening, and I hope to see you guys next time on Ceasefire Part 2, perhaps. Cheers.